Hello, everyone. Welcome to our afternoon session on societal conflict resilience. You could have been anywhere this afternoon at the closing of World Water Week for the last, one of the last sessions, and we really appreciate you sticking around and joining us today. For some housekeeping, you may see here, there's a QR code to scan for the Mentimeter poll. Please pull out your phone and go ahead and join. And then after you join, just keep it open for the whole session. There will be other ways to engage throughout that I'll mention in a little bit. So our purpose for today's session is to have you all question assumptions, to have all of us question some of our assumptions around conflict, climate change, water conflict, but also more broadly, other forms of conflict that relate to water in some way. It's well established that when changes in a basin exceed our societal adaptive capacity to respond to those changes, that there is a potential for conflict to erupt. With unprecedented climate change, changes in geopolitics, and the rise of nationalism, there's a lot of reason to be concerned. And what we want to begin to unpack is what makes societies more resilient to these changes. Is it a given that conflict will erupt? And what also makes societies more vulnerable to the changes? And in addition to looking at conflict kind of broader than just related to water, we'll also be looking at different scales, so not necessarily transboundary, but also national scales. And so now we'll turn to a Mentimeter poll. So please join. Is everyone on the Mentimeter? Good. Good, so here we go. So please rate how much you agree or disagree with the following statements. Climate change will directly increase conflict, instability, and violence. That's the first one. There should be a little scale you can drag. Good. And then water scarcity exacerbated by climate change is a primary cause of conflict and instability. So we want to explore together kind of what your baseline understanding is, what you came into the room thinking. Looks like people are somewhere in the middle. Okay. So through the session, we'll see whether our great speakers help you become more decisive or less decisive on that question. We'll return to that question at the end. And just additionally, throughout the session, there will be, the Menti will be kept open. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the Menti poll in case you'd rather not use the microphone. And if you're online, please make sure to engage through Menti. That will be the form of asking questions throughout the session. So for our session today, we'll have two keynote speeches, one from Florian Kramp from CIPRI, and one from Melissa McCracken at Tufts University. Then we'll have an interactive discussions at your tables facilitated by Susanna Schmeier, and then we'll have some lightning talks. Then at the end, we'll invite all of our speakers up for a Q&A. And again, you can engage in the room or through the Menti poll to ask your questions. And then we'll conclude and again, see if any perspectives have changed throughout the session. Again, keeping in mind whether we can question some of our assumptions that we already have about the linkages between climate change, conflict, and what happens. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Florian Kramp.
Thanks. Good to meet all of you. Thanks for finding us after a long, busy week at the Water Week. I hope you had an exciting few days, and I hope this is going to be the ending highlight of your interactions and sessions here. I'm Florian Krampe. I'm the Director of Studies, Peace and Development at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, where I lead our wider work on environment or on peace and development related research. But I'm also leading for the last 5 years the Climate Change and Risk Program at CIPRI, actually one of the largest programs for much of that time at CIPRI. So in the sense of challenging our thinking on climate change and conflict, so that's what I will start with. I will start with talking a little bit, giving us a research background. So where are we in the debate on climate change and conflict? Does climate change cause conflict? And is that a foregone conclusion? And I want to start with sort of this typical iconic picture, and I don't know how many times you probably have seen that in the last couple of days, because of course a dried out riverbed cracking up is always the symbol of water scarcity that we are putting up. And the headlines we can also almost imagine is like climate change fuels new wars. It's a simple, compelling, and deeply intuitive story that has been dominating much of the news headlines. And I think Melissa will touch on something in that regard also in her talk. But so what I want to do in the next couple of minutes is to challenge that a little bit. Is that really the right story? Is conflict really inevitable in there? And don't get me wrong, climate change, and that is where research, if you take anything away from what I'm going to say, climate change is increasing the risk of conflict. But it's not the only cause. It's not inevitable, and that's what we want to dive in a little bit more. I'm going to start with the least common denominator, where I think pretty much 99% of everyone doing research in this space is going to agree to. And that is the double burden of climate change is increasing the hardship of already highly vulnerable populations. So if taking causality out of the picture, looking at the vulnerability and looking at the spaces where climate change and conflict overlap. And if we think that dealing with a conflict is a complicated situation, then try dealing with a conflict in a situation of increasing drought, extreme flooding, etc. Pick your environmental or climate-related impact at hand. And we see that when we try to look through the data as well. So this is overlaying, it's a German-funded new webpage, the Climate Conflict Vulnerability Index, which is produced by PIC, the Potsdam Institute on Climate Impact Research, and the Bundeswehr University in Germany, overlaying climate risk and conflict risk, and we see quite a strong overlap. We see that a couple of years ago, the USAID, when it still existed, was overlaying climate exposure and fragility risks. And again, we see sort of a deep overlay and purple, there's a dark purple where we see this double burden occurring. And also if we pick a little bit more the harder security side, if we look at peacekeeping operations and peace-building missions, we see that there is a quite strong overlap in where peacekeeping operations are located and where climate impacts are quite severe. That is the least common denominator, no causality in the picture as now. But as I said, where I think the research is today is actually reaching quite a consensus. There's still gaps and there's still more regions and connections to unpack. But overall, I would say that research shows that climate change increases the risk of conflict, increases the risk of violence. It's not the only cause. Context matters. Different social, political, and economic situations are fundamentally impacting how things are playing out. At a bottom level, governance matters. So at CIPRI, we're navigating this space in the following way. And I hope you notice that there are quite a few errors on there, but there are no errors on the connection between people's vulnerability and the insecurity. So again, trying to tone down the deterministic causality arguments because it's more complex. It works and that makes it so difficult as a space. It's very clear in quite a few cases that climate-related impacts are impacting people's vulnerability, and it translates into violence and insecurity and conflict. And in other cases, you have the same conditions, you have the same climate impacts, and something else completely happens. If you want to respond to that, that's really annoying because you don't have a predictability. You have a high degree of uncertainty, and that is what makes it quite complicated. But what we can see from the research that we have done is that climate change impacts people's vulnerability. And then there are 4 pathways. I don't have time to go into them, but just to mention them, that it is deteriorating livelihood conditions, it's migration and mobility, armed groups tactics, and elite exploitation and resource mismanagement that are some of the wider avenues. I want you to think of them not as deterministic mechanics here, but as wider roads that are leading towards the insecurity. The important part, and that is where I think the research needs to go and where we need substantially more insights, where I think the water sector is substantially further ahead in a lot of the research, is sort of that bottom part of it. So what are the entry points of reacting to and responding to this increased insecurity? It is conflict prevention and conflict resolution, as well as development on the far end, because that is a response to the security implications. But of course, well, we need to address the people's vulnerability, because that's where things start to translate into insecurities, right? So climate adaptation and development are fundamental issues we need to tackle. And of course, we're not dealing with climate change. What are we really changing along the way? Because we continuously have to work on adaptation and to larger degrees. And I think there's much more research in that space needed to unpack those, see the connections and the interactions. And coming to the last slide here is where what our research is really showing us is that climate change is fundamentally changing the security landscape. And we can see that. You saw the picture at the beginning. No matter what security framing you have, if it's a very wide one, which is human security at the center, or ecological security, we see the evidence. Or if it's defense, you cannot ignore that climate change is undermining security and is impacting defense postures. So the security landscape is changing. But the really difficult part is on the response side, and the questions are remaining on, like, how do we deal with that? Because with all of that, how we build peace is also changing. And if you don't believe me, that excavator is not a local excavator, that's a peacekeeping equipment. It's from UNMISS, the UN mission in South Sudan, which is not just having peacekeeping troops with their normal equipment, but also needs to have excavators that are actually working on securing roadways for humanitarian aid, that are securing runways so we can deliver aid. So it's an all-encompassing security issue that we need to look at, and where we substantially need to increase the research. Thank you, and I'll hand over to Melissa.
Thank you, Florian. You're going to hear a lot of similar themes as we drill down into the intersection of climate change, conflict, and water specifically. So I thought I'd start with a bit of a provocative title. Are water wars returning? Can I get a show of hands? Are water wars returning? I got a few. Okay. Let's see if you have the same opinion when we finish. So there we go. So we've all seen these broader statements, right? Water is the new oil. The next century will be, or the next wars of the next century will be over water. Water can be a fierce competition as a source of conflict and lead to wars in the future. But when was the last true water war? It was about 5,000 years ago between Mesopotamian city-states in the ancient area of Sumer, between Lagash and Umma. And that was the last and the first true war between states over transboundary water. And so the prevalence of the water wars narrative, particularly in the 80s and the 90s, when we really saw this theme coming forward, has been challenged by the data. And so for those of you that are familiar with the work of Aaron Wolf at Oregon State University, you're probably familiar with this graph where they were able to actually collect data on transboundary water interactions between states and showed that cooperation over transboundary waters is much more likely than conflict over waters. And so this relates to our broader discussion of the nexus between climate change, water, and conflict because of the way we use our narratives and the rhetoric and the vocabulary that we use. So the prevalence of using water wars within our broader narrative, I believe, has kind of a couple of main issues that lead to the perpetuation of water and conflict as being related and a direct link. The first being that there's two different main categories related to water-related conflict. The first, where water is the source of the conflict, so water as a consumable resource, where it is the trigger, it's the underlying cause. And the second, where water is just involved in a conflict that's not about water at all. So water as a weapon or water as a casualty. We tend to conflate that, particularly in the broader public media and within even the political space and the policy space. The other aspect where the narrative tends to get a little muddy, to use a water pun, would be it overlooks the challenges of scale. And so we often conflate wars, interstate conflict declared between sovereign governments, with small-scale violent conflicts that are very important and very real, but we might tend to conflate them based on scale. And the other aspect is conflict sells. It's what sells a newspaper, it sells media. And so we tend to often focus more heavily within the research space, within the practitioner space, on conflict and rather than cooperation. So this is where I want us to sit when we think about the nexus with climate change and ask the question, are we seeing this same narrative that was prominent around water wars in the 80s and the 90s in particular, that has been disproven? Do we see that returning now in the form of climate wars? So as Florian mentioned, we are starting to see headlines such as this, rising storms, climate change's effects exacerbating conflict and hunger, climate wars. And so is this the new form of the water wars narrative returning just in a different shape? And so that's where I think the points that we're trying to make here is we need to think past this deterministic narrative that was disproven with the water wars. So why is this a challenging and why is this the recurrence? When we think about conflict in water, we tend to go towards water scarcity, right? We tend to think, okay, there's this global water crisis, we don't have enough water, our water's got too much, we've got a flood, or it's dirty and we can't have it. So it's all these physical attributes of the water. And from a societal standpoint, it's way easier to say, well, it didn't rain enough, that's why we don't have enough water, it's not my fault. I'm not at fault. Much, much easier from a policy, from a political standpoint, to place the blame on these natural resources. So as we layer on climate change, we're increasing the importance, in a way, of declining natural resources with variability and intensity of climate change on precipitation. And so we're just increasing the narrative, if you will, of there's more physical aspects that are out of our control, and we're de-emphasizing the role that we play in a lot of our own water conflict and cooperation standpoints. So given kind of this setting, I want to go through just the basics of the literature. What is the research that we have right now on the water-related conflict nexus, both at the interstate scale and the intrastate scale? So that way we have a good introduction to our lightning talks, which will dive more into a lot of the nuance and the complexities. So with respect to interstate, broadly, what we can know is that it's very inconclusive as to whether water stress is actually a driver of armed or militarized conflict. And there's more often links to other drivers, such as income or income inequality, as well as population and population distribution. When we look specifically from the empirical data that's actually tracking the relationship, the causal relationship between transboundary water-related conflict, so conflict over water as that consumptive resource, so that first box on my earlier slide. A lot of the scholars were looking at high population, low income, mixed results. We do see some causal ties with unfriendly or historically kind of trusting relationships, or if there's less broader regional stability or dependencies between states, if there's internal conflict within a state, if there's a lack of institutions that are available to absorb any sort of potential impact that's happening, as well as upstream, downstream configurations. But a lot of these have mixed results. So the upstream, downstream, and the water scarcity, we actually have evidence for both. It encourages conflict, but it also is more likely to encourage cooperation. So it depends a lot upon the political context, and all these other factors are really important for us to think about, not just that deterministic narrative, lack of water equals conflict over water. We see similar trends at the intrastate scale as well, although there is significantly less data and research available at this scale. Just it's much more difficult to gather large-scale empirical data for the subnational compared to the transboundary. That's something that's a growing wealth of work that a lot of scholars actually in this room are working on. But ultimately what we see is that there is a risk of water-related conflict and increasing political instability, but there's so many other factors that are coming into play. So very similar to what we see with respect to the broader climate conflict intersections. There are some interesting trends that are emerging around interstate. So we see that water cooperation is more likely at the subnational scale in areas that are water scarce, just like we see at the transboundary scale. So you can see that depicted on the bar chart on the graph, or the bar chart on the slide. Small-scale violence may be more likely when there is lack of access to groundwater. So if you don't have enough surface water available, you don't have an alternative resource, there might be more likely to have conflict as a result. And then weather patterns can potentially contribute to more civil unrest or civil conflicts, and similarly with particularly severe flooding events that might happen. So ultimately, to kind of summarize and wrap up with a few key points that I hope you take away from this is, at both scales, we see more cooperation than we do conflict. Conflict is not just violent conflict, and sometimes conflict can be somewhat beneficial. It can spur conversations, and it can encourage dialogue and changing from the status quo. And we can see that there has been an increase in the amount of conflict that's happening, but it tends to be at the lower levels of intensity. Water allocation, almost always not the cause of conflict primarily. It's usually other political considerations that are coming into play. And that water scarcity can actually lead to more cooperation. So I hope this gets you to challenge some of the broader rhetoric and the overarching narratives within the policy and the public space around water and climate wars, so that we can start to break out of some of this environmentally deterministic thinking. So with that, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Melissa and Florian. I think these were two interesting sort of opening presentations, but now we want you to do some work, right? It's last day, everyone's tired, so please, in order to wake everyone up, we'd like you to discuss on your tables in small groups. Let me just move to the next one. A few questions. And that doesn't have to be an extensive academic debate. It's really just for you to talk to each other and to share your thoughts, and for us then also to see what different perspectives are in the room. So we're particularly interested in what was your thinking, your perspective on the linkages between climate or water or both of them and conflict as you came into this session. Did you have an idea? Were you quite sure on what the link is? Or were you like, well, I don't know, that's why I'm actually coming to the session. And what do you think is something that we would need to know? Are there gaps? Is there any gaps in the research or in your knowledge that you say, well, I can actually only make up my mind on whether there is a link between climate or water and conflict if I knew this or that? And we'd love you to discuss this for about 10 to 15 minutes, just at the table as a bit of an icebreaker, and then I'll ask some of you, welcome to raise your hands then, about your thoughts before we're then zooming into what is in between. So we're then zooming into what is between water and climate on the one side and conflict on the other, because we've seen lots of arrows, we've also seen no arrows because we shouldn't be putting arrows, because we want to move away from these deterministic approaches, but that comes afterwards. First, for you, some thinking, what do you know and what do you need to know better? So about 10 minutes, yeah. It's also a nice way to get to know each other at your table. Okay, I know it's very, very short time only to discuss such a complex topic, so it's basically impossible. But I was wondering if maybe from each group I could just have from one person like a one sentence, I know that's even more difficult, answer either on sort of what your perspectives were when you came in, or what you think were the knowledge gaps where you think there's a particular element that we need to understand before we can make up our mind on the links between water, climate, and conflict. And I'll maybe start here from this group. Who would like to?
I guess in one sentence, we sort of spoke about climate change as maybe a stress threat multiplier, was some of us thought before coming into this session. And then in terms of like one of the gaps missing, we were focusing on sort of that narrative building and sort of translation between some of us youth who have grown up knowing that climate change is an issue and it's a big threat and scares many people, but that's not always understood by some other generations who sort of don't believe in climate change. So sort of that translation is what we're talking about.
Thank you. Let's move to this group. Who would like to?
We didn't hear you. If you share your perspective, we can't hear you.
I'm drawing a blank. I'm not going to be able to.
Who wants to share something?
You don't have to if nobody wants, but I'll move to the other table and you can give me a sign if you still change your mind. Here, this table, who would like to give us a quick answer on the perception you came in with, or... Okay, you're being pointed at, so...
It's such a stereotype that the white guy has to do it. She said a lot to say. She had a lot to say. He had a lot to say. I don't know. All right. Makes me very uncomfortable. I think that, like, the one sentence summary, and we couldn't, like, systematically walk through each of the questions was, but if you look at them kind of distill from the conversation is yes and no, is that it's never one directional, right? So the scale matters of what you're defining as conflict, the location, the politics. It can be either a vehicle for peace or an exacerbator of conflict. It can be both at the same time. And I think because of the richness of the conversation, my guess is that's pretty much what people thought coming in. There was just some people didn't even get to talk, but I guarantee they had a lot of things to say. So I hope that.
Yeah, we'll have another round later for people to engage, ask questions, but also maybe contribute. This table here, who was volunteered here or wants to volunteer or...
So we basically just had a round of introduction and really superficially reflected on the questions. But what I found interesting is that we have very different people on the table. So really from student, relatively new to the topic, researcher that already dive much deeper, the policy perspective, and me maybe more private sector. And I think we agreed on that, just like the other table, that there seem to be obviously some factors in between, climate change or changes in water availability and conflict or cooperation. And we would like to know more about these factors and hope that we're going to learn more about them now.
That's such a perfect segue, as if we had planned it, but we haven't, I promise, because that's exactly what we'll do now. We'll now move into what is in between, what drives the linkages between water and conflict or climate and conflict, and what are the arrows in between, if there are any, anyway. And we'll do that with 3 lightning talks. 3 people presenting 3 different perspectives. I'll introduce them in a moment. I just want to remind everyone online, but also in the room, that if you have any questions that come up while you're listening to the talks, feel free, well, to either remember them for the Q&A later, or if you can't, put them in the Mentimeter. We're picking them up and we're tracking them, and that's also quite helpful for us to know sort of what questions are out there in the audience. But let's move right into the lightning talks. We'll move into the first one, which looks at the past is not the future. We'll be looking at climate data, again, in the context of the linkages between water, climate, and conflict. And we look at discussing how physical uncertainties related to climate and water might or might not drive societal resilience to conflict. And we have Kate Brauman with us for that. She comes from the University of Alabama, from the Global Water Security Center. Kate, you have 5 minutes.
So they asked me to summarize climate in 5 minutes. Let's go. Which I will not try to do, but there's really two things that I wanted to try to convey here in the next couple of minutes is that climate change information can be really complicated. It can be hard to understand locally in the places where we care about, where we want to try to tie it to conflict or not. And water is particularly complicated. This is a graphic from the IPCC, which actually they do great graphics. And this is still really hard to understand. So what I'm hoping that I can convince you in the next 4.5 minutes is that the past is not the future. We need to be thinking about climate change, but we need to be really thinking about what does that mean for how we interpret the present and how we think about the future, and that climate projections are complicated. So we need to think about how we're communicating them and how we understand them. So let me start out by taking us to Brazil. Dams, everybody loves a dam, everybody loves some hydropower, and everybody hates it when the hydropower promises don't come true. This is what we've been talking about in Belo Monte. Often this is getting blamed on climate change. So what's happening here? Well, we know that low rainfall at Belo Monte has indeed been limiting its power production. To me, that really asks the question of, well, what did we expect? Is this doing what we thought it would do? So how reliable is the rainfall here? What are we looking at? So normal rainfall in the watershed here is about 2,000 millimeters. And we're going to look at what the difference from normal looks like. Going back all the way into the 1970s, what you can see is if we think about that normal being 2,000, 1,900 millimeters, it was pretty wet in the 1970s and 80s when the Belo Monte hydropower plant was proposed. If anybody know about dams, you know it takes a while. So it was not actually until 2016 that the Belo Monte plant was opened. And what you can see is that over that time period, there was quite a bit of fluctuation in rainfall. There certainly were wet periods, but there also were some really dry periods. And if somebody had been really thoughtfully thinking about what the capacity of this plant was likely to be, you would have been looking at this kind of variation, not at what was happening back in the 70s when they first started talking about this. Then, of course, things get worse. This part of Brazil has actually faced many years in a row of dry years, low precipitation. And we've seen associated reductions in the ability to produce hydropower at this plant. And so what you can see is that there's a clear trend here. Is this attributable to climate change, or is this about other kinds of weather phenomena? We don't actually know that, and the fact of the matter is that it doesn't matter. What matters is that the past is not the present, and it's not likely to be the future, and we need to think about building systems that are resilient to that. And when we look at something like the whole power system in Brazil, this is actually happening in plants across the country. So these are the kinds of products that the Global Water Security Center produces, where we're putting together some of these biophysical data with maps. So what about the future? Because that only took us into the present. So you often probably hear people talk about the future and climate change. How is climate change going to affect water? So one of the things you might hear is that average annual rainfall it's going to increase a little bit. What does that mean? Well, when we do our analyses, this is the kind of graph that we often get. So one thing that you might want to notice is that we've got 1985 in here. We've got the 20-year average around 85 and the 20-year average around 2010. 2010 is not the same as 1985, so the past is not the present. But then we're looking to the future, and there's a lot going on here. And if you don't spend a lot of time looking at these kind of data, you probably don't know what this represents, which is actually a multi-model mean, averaged across space, averaged across a bunch of time, looking at multiple time periods with a couple different scenarios. This is not something that's super easy to communicate. So these are the kinds of graphs that we've been moving towards producing to try to help people understand at a glance, what does the future look like? So we've reduced to only one scenario. And what we're looking at is, in the past, this is where the average is, this is how much variation we see around it, so you've got those different years. And then as we look into the future, we have some synthetic years that represent the kind of future we expect, so that again, you can see what the variation is around that average. This happens to be for Gabon, where there was some interest in hydropower and how that might or might change moving into the future. Turns out they're in a pretty good spot. If you're going to build hydropower, Gabon's not a bad place to do it. Well, what about if that variation is going to change, or if dry years, for example, are going to get drier, even if we don't expect to see much of a change in the median? So these are the kinds of graphs that we're producing for this. So what you see here, again, is the past. It's hard to understand the future if you don't understand the past. Looking at what's the average, but then over time, this is just a time series annually of how much does rainfall fluctuate over time. And as you can see here, it's a lot. We're looking at about 200 millimeters off of a 1,000 millimeter mean, so a good 20% up and down. What about the future? Well, the average isn't that different. If somebody said, oh, we've got an average of 1,000, we've got an average of 950, you think, oh, that's not so different. But what matters here is that what we expect to see is that those dry years are getting drier. And this, again, is the kind of graphic that we're putting together to help people understand at a glance, this is what it means as climate changes. This one happened to be for Zimbabwe, again, where people are quite reliant on rain-fed agriculture, and those dry years make a real difference. So I'll finish with the last one that we hear about a lot, snow days and rain days. What does that mean? How are snow days and rain days changing? So this is a graph for the Helmand River Basin. And what you can see on here, what I'm going to show you is over the winter season, when there's precipitation, how much of it is snow compared to rain? And what you can see is back in 1985, it was pretty cold in the winter, and what that meant is that in December, January, February, most of the precipitation was snow, not rain. As we got forward into 2010, we're seeing warmer springs, we're getting more melt, and then as we look into the future, we're seeing really no months with almost entirely snow. And that has big implications for how you're thinking about your reservoir management. It's really important in a place like the Helmand River Basin in Afghanistan and downstream into Iran in terms of how much water is available both during the wet and the dry season. So, to finish up, the past is not the future. We really need to be thinking about things or how things have changed to date. And as we think about the climate projections, they are complicated, but they can be clearer. We can do better. So happy to talk about any of that later.
Thanks a lot, Kate. I think it's clear that these sessions should be more than 90 minutes. I think it's a challenge that we've seen throughout the week, but okay, I'm biased, but I think especially for this session, it would have been really nice to have more time to get more detailed presentations, but also then to engage with you. But let's move immediately to the next topic, and let's turn that whole perspective around, that thinking water, climate, leads to conflict, right? Which we, I think, have by now all established is it's more complex like that. But let's also look at what conflict, war, violence can actually do to societal resilience, which then in turn might not, we'll hear, influence again how we can deal with conflict or not. And I'm happy to invite Stefan Döring to the stage here. He works for the University of Uppsala and PRIO and is an expert on that topic and also has 5 minutes only, unfortunately, Stefan.
Okay, thank you so much, Susanne, and also thank you, Melissa, for organizing this great panel. Okay, so something that I really liked about what I really liked about the talk is like, okay, so what are we going to do about it? So something I often thought about is like, okay, so conflict doesn't necessarily arise from scarcity, but like, what happens if we have conflicts, and what does it mean for people that when they have access to water, right? So something that I think probably a lot of you think is like obvious, but like there is actually not that much research on it, is that what happens when war impacts water resources in society, right? And fortunately, in the last 5 years or so, we have seen an increase in armed conflicts and wars compared to the decades before that. And that's why also this is a topic that we need to talk about, unfortunately, every year. And we know that, or we know from other research that armed conflict disrupts infrastructure, disrupts, contaminates the soil, contaminates water. But what does that actually mean for people, right? I mean, when people lose their safe water access, and what does it mean? How do we need to engage with societies that have been affected by this? And then there is more than just this physical damage, right? So one of the important points that I've seen in my research as well is that when we lose access to water or other resources, that also has an impact on social trust, or on a trust towards institutions. So for example, here I'm showing some slides from a study that I'm currently leading on in Ukraine. These are survey results from just 3 weeks ago, so they're very fresh. And we asked people like how much do they. You can't see. You might not be able to see the question, but I'll just tell it to you. So we asked people they're supposed to tell us how much they think the current war has affected the environment, and we asked them many different things. But here I've taken the rivers and groundwater, and you can see that the scale goes from not at all to a very like extreme extent, and you can see that. Like more than half of the response, this is a nationally representative sample of the non-occupied parts of Ukraine. So lots of these people have like witnessed these things, like the effect on the rivers, the effect on the groundwater. We have similar questions on coastal environment and forests, and we've also asked people like to what extent do they have like witnessed this themselves, and we can really see that this. Even though there's a lot of other suffering, like, right, I'm not trying to like not talk about this, but we also like need to talk about what does it mean for the environment, and what does it mean for water resources, because some of this pollution will take decades to reverse. And here's just a graphic that I took from UNICEF, where, for example, like we often talk about how deadly and how violent wars are, but actually what's more deadly in wars is the non-access to water, right? So there's more children dying because of diarrhea or other diseases that are due to disruption of water than through the bullets themselves, right? So here's some graphs that are a little bit older. I have also some unpublished work on this, but this is also something we see right now in Gaza, that we see in Sudan, something also that we see in Ukraine, is that if there's one side is the disruptive effect of the war, but then there's the other effect, is what does it mean for vulnerable groups when they don't have access to safe water? And then the next question is then, so we still need research to document this even better, but then the other question is like, what does this mean for communities, right? And so I have done some research on, with a colleague, I've done some research on what's the impact of drought for people that have been affected by war, and we can, for example, here we're looking at an outcome of how much people cooperate, and we can see that people cooperate a lot when there's droughts, right? So that's actually a positive thing, right? People actually come together to cooperate. But something we can see in our research is that they cooperate less with other groups if they have been hit by droughts or if they've been hit by water scarcity, right? So there is something like some social element that, well, you know, maybe you come together and like work together with people, but maybe you're not, it's more inward, right? So and that's something where we need institutions, where we need humanitarian action to sort of cross these boundaries. And like, because the impact of the war has like also social impacts. And I just wanted to close on this because I'm also really interested in like what does it mean for health and mental health. So here I've plotted, this is an unpublished study, I've plotted how much the impact on mental health measured as PTS. This was a clinical survey item. And we can see that people that have been affected by drought have much higher PTS levels than people that have just, quote unquote, just affected by war. And it's data that shows this like aggregating effects, right? So it's like actually more so the traumatizing effects of war, but adding on to things like if you've been disrupted, like climate disruptions or disruptions through the water scarcity, actually add on to the mental health problems that we have, and that in turn goes back to things that I just talked about, which is like how much are we willing to cooperate, right? Because that very much relies also on your health. And that's where I wanted to stop.
Thanks a lot, Stefan, for adding these additional dimensions. And you can see it's actually getting more and more complex. There are more and more dimensions in here, which in a way is maybe a little unsatisfying, right? Because we said we shed clarity on some aspects of the water, climate, and conflict debate here in this session. But I think it's nice to see all these different dimensions and to highlight especially what is often overlooked, like psychological stress with individuals, but also in-group, out-group behavior, which maybe years down the road could still have its conflictive impacts. But let's move to the last lightning talk, where we'll be focusing on the community level. Kyung-mi Kim from the Swedish Defense University, if you want to join me on the stage. Kyung-mi will be looking at how conflict-affected communities deal with societal resilience or try to build societal resilience in the water context. Kyung-mi.
So I prepared very poor PowerPoint slide, so hopefully this doesn't disturb you to focus on my story. So this is basically part of my postdoc project. My postdoc project looks at the double burden of climate change and conflict. So now I mostly focus on my research on Myanmar, which is maybe the country you might not be so familiar with. It's a country that has about 50 million population, and since the coup in 2021, it's been heavily affected by both the crisis of military coup and also the various the various disasters. But I think every time I come to the World Water Week and present something, I always try to focus on something like positive, like it's the way forward. I can say so much about this negative coping mechanisms that this conflict economy brought on, like the rare earth mining is mushrooming in Myanmar in various parts. That's affecting terribly on the water quality. Now the water pollution is also spreading to Thailand, so it's becoming a transboundary issue. There's a deforestation, basically destroying the watersheds, and also I want to talk about this mangrove restoration efforts that communities are still doing in these very difficult situations, but they also have a lot of increase in making charcoals from mangroves. So these are the negative coping mechanisms that's happening at the community. So I'm not saying that the communities are always doing great and doing something right during this conflict situation to preserve their water resources, but there are still examples that I'm trying to find in this project to see how communities try to avoid and avoid this further harm, and also try to find a way forward. So I have two case studies that I have conducted. The one is on this community-led disaster response during the cyclone Mocha that was about 2 years ago. And that I saw that these communities in Rakhine State during the Mocha, the cyclone that was very heavily destroyed the houses and also a lot of infrastructure in Rakhine State, which is very heavily conflict affected. They really responded collectively by drawing on their own resources and just entirely the volunteer-based networks and aid was that was the only basically the help that the people received, because international aid could not enter due to the political difficulties, and the junta would not let this aid to channeled into the conflict area. So that was one of the prime examples to see that how the disaster recovery can also be done by the community. And you can also see the lessons for the international community to deal with this type of situation, that you cannot always go to the national government to deliver humanitarian aid. You also have to be creative to look for credible or sometimes even the private traders to deliver humanitarian aid. So you can see that the scale of the problem can be high, and this kind of a risk is a really in a long term, it's difficult to deal with because it doesn't maybe create immediate conflict over water, but over time this will degrade trust among the community and between communities with the different ethnic identities and so on, and it can increase the conflict risk. And also, yeah, there's a harm to the water resources in the region because you destroy the environment and also the infrastructure to manage this water resources in this type of settings. And then I look at this more positive example of community-led mangrove restoration, which is I was really skeptical to look at this at the beginning because how can they do projects now? It's the conflicts are everywhere. People are forcibly recruited, and I just couldn't really be like believing that this can happen. But actually, then I found out these local organizations working with the community, and they engaged the community to talk about the benefits of doing this in their villages, and they actually managed to get the community buy-in to go ahead with the replanting of mangroves and also the removing like weeds and so on to defend the coastlines, which is essential for the sea level rise. That's really a big risk for Myanmar's coastal population. So I do think that there is still plenty of room for the international community to support these efforts meaningfully. Although because of the conflict settings, it is difficult to know who to engage, who to support, who are the right people. So I think the transactional cost of international support can be high. So I think there are definitely lessons to be learned more from the project. Hopefully the papers will be published and then I can talk about it more openly. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kyung-mi. We'll now just get sorted here. Invite all the speakers, the keynote speakers, and the lightning talk speakers to join me here on the stage for a panel. We have, if I can ask all of you to join me here. We are 5 speakers, we have 4 chairs, so maybe you can test your conflict resolution skills over scarce resources already now. I will use this microphone and you can share this one, and we should also have one microphone in the room, or yes, there actually, for any questions that you might want to ask. Everyone settled?
Only I settled.
I will not comment on that. Okay, great. Well, we had, as per any good panel discussion, a few questions prepared for the panelists, but I actually think it's much more exciting to hear your questions and just focus on those. So any questions that you might have on what you heard, but also thoughts that you want to share on whether you're thinking about the links between water and climate and conflict, and maybe we shouldn't even be talking about links anymore, but the complexity, how they have changed in the sessions, how you'll take that forward, please share them with us. Our friendly volunteers in the back will bring the microphone to you. And please just introduce your name and maybe the institution you belong to so that we know. The first one's always difficult. Who is not shy? Okay. And we'll maybe collect 2 to 3 questions and then take it from there, please.
Hi, I'm Natasha Hodeski, and I work at the Ostrom Workshop in water governance. And I'm really interested in your ideas about how we expand the definitions of what constitutes conflict. So I come from like the Jan Selby tradition of subjugation dressed up as cooperation. And so all of these things that look at the way that we should like promote higher levels of cooperation, do they actually mask conflict? I'm really interested in any thoughts you have on that.
Thank you. Another question, comment, thought? Here to that side, please.
Thank you. I'm Sobia. I'm a young geographer, human geographer, researching on the intersection of climate, water, and intergenerational justice, focus on mountain communities of Pakistan. So I'm really keen to know about your views about not simplifying, because we recently witnessed transboundary issue between Pakistan and India that was not really, there was a lot different narratives around issues. Now AI and information, flow of information actually obscure whether it was it water war or not. And what do you think about the situatedness of different discourses? Because you just said, where I'm coming from, I have seen tensions over water, but that's not being framed as conflict, that the colleague just asked. So if there's water, you just said it's not climate change is not leading, water conflict is not in deterministic way, but it also depends on the social stratification, whether it's a pastoralist community or whether it's more complex industrial society. So how do you see all these complexities into the nexus of climate and water?
We've been in all the same panels together and audiences, so I just couldn't resist. I'm going to ask the exact opposite question. Why do we have to keep saying it's so complicated? Because it might serve the non-conference room world if we could say something different. So how would you all simplify this into a digestible way that could educate and motivate and provide advocacy tools?
Mm-hmm. Thanks. We'll let the panelists answer and then come to the second round of questions. Well, we had questions around what is conflict, but also then what is a water conflict or maybe not, but then also the question, are we simplifying, are we not simplifying? Who wants to start?
Can I start with simplifying?
You have the microphone, so you...
Yeah. Power grab. No, thank you for the question. I think maybe on the security, just a broader reflection and on your point on simplifying. I think it depends whom we're talking to. And there's a tendency, and making myself really unpopular on the academic side, but if it comes to climate change and conflict, we have been discussing causality meticulously for so long. That is a great academic exercise. And if you're in the field, it helps you zero. We could have identified the risk that is there, no determinism, no prediction that this will play out, decades ago. Raise awareness and find interventions for prevention instead of waiting for proof that something happened. We're not waiting for the hurricane to hit exactly before we are evacuating, right? So we need to find simplification and we need to find the right messages for the right audiences. In the climate change and conflict space also specifically, I'm stunned sometimes by how much we're focusing on climate change and how little we're paying attention to security. So for me, it's really important that we draw a distinction somewhere. We don't have to go Uppsala 25 battle-related deaths type to just talk about a conflict. If it's 24, no. But we need to draw a distinction because at some point it's just climate change work. It's climate adaptation. It's not the security element. So what is the gain of the security element? And it's because different actors, different elements come into the picture.
I'll also weigh in on that because I think it's a great question, this balance of complexity with simplicity. So at the Global Water Security Center, we work with the Defense Department in the United States, and they are, let me tell you, they are not interested in causal loop diagrams. My hypothesis is actually that causal loop diagrams are super useful for the person that creates them and entirely meaningless for everyone else. I told you I was a provocateur. But so one of the things that we've been doing, I'm happy to talk about this afterwards, is trying to sort of unfold pathways from climate to conflict that think about mechanisms and potential mechanisms. And especially on the biophysical side, there's a lot of complexity in the details, but there's a lot of simplicity in the categories. It hit your farm, it hit your electricity sources, it hit you. It had economic impacts, it had health impacts. You know, there's just not that many categories of things. What we then see, and this is, I think, where the really interesting complexity comes in, is that could be good or bad, because what we're looking at is the potential for these biophysical drivers to leverage social situations. Is it exacerbating grievance, or is it actually alleviating grievance in some way? And you need a lot of information locally to understand which way that's going to go, but you can simplify to say, this is what we should be looking for. And I think that's where the balance perhaps can be valuable.
Before we maybe get to the next round of questions, Melissa, did you want to weigh in on India, Pakistan, given that you've worked on that a lot?
Or the definition. I was thinking of the definition one.
You're taking the easy one.
On both. For those that know me, I wrote a dissertation on and defining one single word, which is transboundary water cooperation. I guess that's 3 words. So your question speaks to me in terms of how we expand the definition of conflict. And so one of the things, I would 100% agree. So one of the things I would argue for is that I don't think cooperation has a inherently positive value. So I argue that cooperation is neutral. Cooperation is the action of working together for mutual benefits. It can be constructive, it can be destructive. And then when we're thinking about the definitions of conflict, you can have conflict that spurs action that might break the status quo and where there's inequality that's happening. So I think it's just looking a little bit more of a nuanced framing of these definitions so that we can apply them to the spaces and to get what we're aiming towards, and that's going to vary depending on who's defining what they're aiming for. So it's very variable. In terms of the India-Pakistan conflict and the discourses that are around there, I think the broader perspective, and I've done a little bit of work in the Indus, so I will just kind of put a little cap on that it's not my particular area of expertise, but it's something that I've been digging into a bit more. And the water and the geopolitical conflict have become heavily intertwined. And so there is an underlying water conflict between India and Pakistan over the interpretation of the treaty and the construction of run-of-the-river hydropower projects. So there very much is a water conflict. But there's also the broader context of the political conflict between these two states. And those are very messily intertwined. And so it's impacting the discourse. And I think in the current situation, it's inhibiting the ability for kind of a desecuritization or depoliticization of the water aspect. And so it's limiting our ability to then cooperate on the Indus, on the water part in the future because of the geopolitics.
I think we should focus on some questions again. I'm sure you'll all get still the chance to respond. We had one here in the front, Jenny, and then we'll move on. Here in the very front. You need to use the microphone because we have online participants. Sorry.
Jenny Granvall with the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. A question of clarification for Stefan. You were talking about drought, cooperation, in-groups, out-groups, very interesting. I know that you have been focusing a lot of your research on some African communities, but now you're also looking at Ukraine, which the Swedish government has as number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 priority country over the next years. So I'm really interested in, would you say that this with cooperation and in-groups, out-groups, would it apply also to the Ukrainian society?
Thanks. We'll give you a moment to think and collect some other questions right behind. Yes.
Hi, I'm Edith. I'm a freelancer. And thank you very much, first of all, for all of your contributions so far. It has actually brought back a conversation I had with Afghan and Uzbek folks in Termez, which is in the bottom of the very, very southern part of the Silk Road in Uzbekistan a couple of months back, where we were talking about water and peace and transboundary cooperation. And it's a group of farmers, mostly in essence, who knew the concept of transboundary cooperation very well. But they looked at me and they said, why don't we scrap transboundary from this concept and just say cooperation? Because when we look at our history, there has been borders, but then for many, many centuries before, there haven't been borders. So the conversation shifted into further than what everybody here has been speaking about, which is prevention and the risks and all of that. So my question is, what would you think about taking this up one step further and saying it's not just the prevention, but as a pathway for peace to bring this up? And what would be necessary to maybe take that additional step in this discourse?
Thanks. We'll take one more question. If there is one. Yes, all the way on the other side.
Hi, thank you for this lovely session. I would like to ask if you could reflect a little bit on what you would perceive as a positive outcome going forward in the political realm in terms of regarding this cooperation and conflict. Wait, backtracking a little bit. I think it's interesting what was said about conflict not always being negative in this nexus. Especially looking at the situation in where there are asymmetrical power relations in water. What would you see as a positive path forward in terms of politics going in the cooperation or conflict? Yeah, you understand my question, sorry.
Yes. Thank you. I would suggest we first take the question on sort of communities, drought, and the in and out group dimension. And Stefan, but I think Kyung-mi, you might also be able to add to that with your experience working with communities. But I think the question was to you first, no way to get out. And then we'll ask one of the other three to think about the other two questions, the last two questions we had, which I think we can combine a bit. Stefan.
I mean, I try to answer it sort of a bit more general also. I mean, in and out groups matter for trust, right? They matter for any form of cooperation, whatever it's neutral or if it's like for water sharing, right? And they,
It was off.
Oh, yeah. Okay, well, I'll just continue. I hope everyone in the room heard what I said. But, I'm coming to my main point now, so that's, I mean, so, and for water sharing, for example, or like in and out groups matter for what we do, right? So, and in and out groups can be downstream, upstream, right? They can be institutional, like coming from an institution or being a water user, being like different water users, right? They're like dependent on what we use, right? And that's what we also have trust, right? I mean, I could trust you, but maybe I don't trust you in a different setting or something like that, right? And that's very important to know, like, and that's why sort of it answers like, it goes a little bit to what we had earlier. I mean, sometimes there is complexity and we can simplify as much as we want, like the complexity doesn't go away, right? So, but what we can do is try, what we also discussed, like when given a certain context, how can we make this understandable for a specific user, right? I think that's how I'm thinking about a lot of these things. That's also how I'm thinking about these in-group, out-group dynamics, right? Yeah, I think I'll go to it.
Kyung-mi, do you want to add from Myanmar?
Well, I haven't looked at this conflict aspect, but I mean, the PhD project definitely looked at how the in-group cooperated when they faced the environmental challenge, which was a hydropower dam construction in this case. And I mean, you could see how they define in-group. It can be incredibly powerful to mobilize resources within the community to respond to a collective challenge. So then you can see some of this positive dynamics of like, okay, so they can organize themselves to find collective solution, but also even though the groups share identity and they have the connection, it doesn't always lead to the same kind of outcomes that they got together. So, I mean, I think there is definitely the variation here, and I think the key is, do they have social organizations and networks in place that can be used for the kind of facilitation? So I mean, the case of Ukraine, I think some of your data on this also in-group and out-group trust, it's coming from the refugees, right? So from the Syrian civil war. So these are two different samples, and you can totally see why the data will look different, because one is Ukraine, which has a very high level of social organization. It was functioning society. And then the refugee society, which probably had less of that. Well, but you know, the results were, well, I mean, so in different settings, although the outcomes were the same then. But but I think also the different settings can have different ways for people to organize and so on. So I don't know. I feel like there's something there. But just about the conflict definition, I do think that this policy relevance of this discussion that we are having. So I think we had a lot of this talk, like why are we still talking about this at this time? And I do think that, and also you did tell me about this infinite game, which is also that I think about it sometimes. So we don't see the water conflict now, but that's not maybe the reason why we should think that there is no water conflict, because this conflict can happen in the future. And this cooperation now, I mean, for example, this example of the AI related technology is now used to predict flooding risk in Vietnam because of the Red River shared between China and Vietnam. China shares data, but not always, not frequent enough to give the flood warning. Then the Vietnamese government, who's very into machine learning and all of this, they really looking at the models to see the flood risk for their reservoirs. So it is used practically, and there is a bit of a cooperation, but I do think that there is a bit of a like pushing the problem back to just to ignore it and postpone in a form of cooperation. So actually the risk still persists. So I think it is also like something that I still think that this is still relevant for policy, just because we're not only talking about the no conflict today, but we should also think about no conflict in 5 years, 10 years in the future.
I think that's a good point. I'm wondering whether Florian, Kate, and Melissa, you want to add to that, also sort of as, unfortunately, your last statement, but this whole question, conflict, cooperation, but also I think the future was sort of the key element of the question.
Yeah. Last statement, pressure.
In short.
Just on that, on your in-group, out-group Ukraine example, I think one thing we're forgetting, if we're thinking about cooperation, we're not going back probably anytime soon to an OSCE-style environmental trust building type of measures we had after 2014, right? But what I think we're forgetting in the in-group, out-group dynamic here is there's society and government. We treat Ukraine pretty much as one entity, but I think there's also elements between civil society and the government we need to treat in that space, and that will be really important to build and think about that cohesion. So, which leads me to the other point, which I think goes to Edith's and your point, and to end on that, I think the most positive outcome of the conflicts potentially that I could see is that we start to recognize that these are political questions. And going to make myself here very unpopular maybe in this room or in this institution of the Water Week, but also a technical solution, if we are emphasizing that, to solve a conflict is a political decision, right? And if we recognize that, we're one step further to moving forward.
Totally agree. And I think one of the reasons that water and climate, that there's this real desire to tie it to conflict is because it feels like there's the potential for predicting water and climate, and therefore we'll be able to predict conflict or cooperation, right? And it's trying to move political questions into the technical and the biophysical, which doesn't mean that there's not potential for us to understand better what's happening and potentially to be predictive. But I absolutely agree. I think we need to think about how the political and the social is integrated with the biophysical, because on its own, the biophysical isn't what matters.
Melissa, for the last...
Ooh, the last word. I guess maybe coming to the question on kind of conflict being potentially positive, and kind of the reframing back to the definitions element. So when we're saying like conflict can be positive, it's more that it's a momentum or a trigger for driver action. So if there is some sort of like just status quo we're accepting, but maybe there's some sort of disaster event or a drought or some sort of political change that might happen that leads to increasing tensions, and then people get dissatisfied enough to take that movement forward. It's at that threshold where we need to make sure we have enough institutional capacity, either intervention, trust, whatever form it takes place at what scale we're looking at, that we can turn that into cooperation that's ideally, in my opinion, for equitable and sustainable benefits for all the users, including the environment of the system. Or it could easily turn into more of an escalation of conflict. So how can we find it at that tipping point, to use some of the ecology language, and then how can we move it forward to more of a positive outcome?
Thanks. Big round of applause to our panelists. I think we've covered a lot of interesting questions. I think we've maybe discovered even more questions. There's definitely one PhD topic on the in-group, out-group dynamics. There's many more PhD topics here to be found, many more research questions, but I'm going to hand over to Zoe again. Yeah, when you are allowed to leave.
Friendly kicking us out.
Okay, thanks again to our panelists, and thanks everyone for sticking it out. Please return to the Menti briefly so we can do our last poll. So we can see if your perspectives changed. At the beginning we were pretty evenly split, hanging out right in the middle, but let's see if anyone's gotten more opinionated on the topic. And while we're doing that, I just wanted to mention we had a very academic presentation that we convened for you, seeing that we really think it's important to understand what gaps exist and what the research is saying, especially when we're trying to formulate policies. So that research perspective is pretty important to understand. The poll responses had swung really sharply into one direction. Now they're back, somewhat towards the middle. But we do see people more or less slightly disagree or feel neutral about the linkages between climate change, conflict, and then water scarcity being exacerbated. And so just linking back to some of the discussions that you had and what you reported back from your discussions, we saw that the narratives don't necessarily show that climate change, in media we see a lot of headlines around climate change leading to war, but from the research we saw that there's not really that causal link. We heard that context matters a lot, so thinking about the timing, length, and dryness of dry years. Also, cooperation and conflict with whom, the in-groups and the out-groups. And looking at different dimensions as well that Stefan brought in on the mental health. And then thinking about the importance of supporting community-led efforts to build resilience against disasters. So thank you all for engaging in the session and really participating as we were going through the interactive discussion. I heard people really participating even at the end of the day, so that was great to see. And then thank you so much to our co-conveners for this session, CIPRI, the Global Water Security Center at the University of Alabama, the Fletcher School at Tufts, IHE Delft, Uppsala University, PRIO, and especially to Melissa McCracken for organizing this session. Thank you.